Welcome to the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that our institute is on Parramatta South Campus, which is on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their country for thousands of years. We also want to pay our respect to the First Nations elders of the countries we are all sitting on today, past, present, and emerging. Chinese Australian history is one of the key areas of interest at this institute. In 2020, we held Chinese Australian History Online Series 1, delivered by our adjunct Professor Michael Williams. We then had Series 2 throughout 2021. Both series have been a great success and reached interested audiences in Australia and internationally. The recordings of both series can still be accessed on our website, which will be posted in chat. So we are very excited to launch our Chinese Australian History Series 3 for 2022, and thrilled that the first session features this very unique book of oral history written by a Chinese Australian for the first time, South Flows the Pearl. This book contains some of the earliest Chinese Australian family history that has never been told, family stories. The author of the book was Mavis Gok Yan Guo Meihua, who was born in Perth, Western Australia in 1916, to a Chinese father and European Australian mother. She lived in China as a child in the 1920s and 1930s, then returned to China again in 1946. In China, Mavis worked for the Chinese Industrial Cooperative Movement in Shanghai, Gonghe Guoji, then joined the Xinhua News Agency as an editor, Xinhua She. She also then taught English in the Beijing Second Foreign Language Institute, Beiyarban. So she was very well known in China. She returned to Australia in 1981 at the age of 65. A renewed interest in her own family history led her to embark on this ambitious oral history project between 1987 and 1995. Sadly, Mavis didn't live to see the publication of the book. Fortunately, though, Mavis's daughter Xiaoman Yan Xiaoman and son-in-law Richard Horsberg, through their shared tenacity and dedication, completed the book as editors. So this has given us the opportunity to discuss and read this very valuable book. Just briefly introducing the panelists today. Xiaoman was born in Beijing in 1954. She traveled with her mother Mavis to Australia in 1981. Where she completed her BA at the now Canberra University. She worked as a data analyst in the market research industry for 30 years. Putting her skills to good use, she has designed a series of maps of this book, South Flows the Pearl, and produced an English-Chinese glossary of names, places, and organizations that future historians and scholars will find invaluable. Richard was born in Moree, New South Wales in 1950. He received his BA and then a law degree from the University of Sydney. He worked in employment law and human resources policy with the New South Wales Public Service. For this book, Richard focused on tracking down and liaising with the interviewee families, amassing a trove of photographs and documentation, and conducting further research into each family's history. We are very pleased to have Xiaoman and Richard at today's conversation to share their stories about the book. Hello, Xiaoman. Hello, Richard.
Hi, everybody.
We are also very honored and privileged to have our adjunct professor, Dr. Stephen Fitzgerald, AO, to open and join this conversation. Dr. Fitzgerald has been a government, academic, and a consulting specialist on China and Australia's relations with China and Asia since the 1960s. He was the first Australian ambassador to China and has held many professorial appointments at various universities in Australia. He is currently the chair of the board of the Museum of Chinese in Australia, MOCA. So let's first welcome Dr. Stephen Fitzgerald, AO, to open the conversation.
Thank you, Professor. Let me begin by saying I'm actually a bit in awe of this book. The blurb on the back cover says, "These stories will change how you think about Australian history." Now that's a pretty big claim, but I have to say that even as someone familiar with the Chinese Australian story, these stories did impact on the way I think about Australian history. And not only that, I think they also make you think again about what is an Australian and about how that looks from inside a particular cultural heritage and one that is different from your own. And also how you think about a person's attachment to a country of origin and culture, while at the same time being thoroughly of this country. A dinkum Aussie, if you like. Now, I use that term knowing, as many of you may do, that the origin of the word dinkum is probably Chinese, from the 19th century goldfields of Australia, and meaning genuine or pure gold. There's a rival claim to that, to its origin, I know, from Derbyshire in England, but I'll stick with the Chinese version because it's the oldest recorded use of the term, and because of the delicious irony that this quintessentially Australian self-descriptor comes from Chinese Australians. I'm also in awe of Mavis Gok-Yen. With the fine instinct and skill of a historian, but no real supporting institutional base in a university or museum, for example, she saw the need, conceived the idea, conducted and transcribed the oral histories, and wrote the narratives introducing each one. And she linked their stories in a way that makes a larger narrative and what ultimately became, in this book, a significant history of Chinese in Australia, captured while there were still people who lived or knew these stories of early Chinese Australian migrants, a precious part of the history of Australia. What's really important about these stories, and what I think readers will love about them, is that they are far from the stereotype of the goldfields and the victim history. They're family stories told by family, of lived history stretching back into the 19th century. And there is a detail and intimacy to them, so little known or celebrated in the dominant narratives of Australian history, which is what makes them so valuable. Their story, that is the history and participation and contribution of Chinese Australians, is a major strand in the social fabric of Australia. In importance only after first Australians and then British, and in their mixing and mingling with first Australians and British, many of them were in fact multicultural in outlook and acceptance more than a century before that term was introduced in Australia. And their history needs to be elevated into the national story, not just for Chinese Australians themselves, but for everyone. Jing, you asked if I would mention the Museum of Chinese in Australia here in Sydney, of which I've recently become chair. And I'm happy to do so because that is what this museum intends when it is open from the end of this year. That is the elevation of Chinese Australian history into the national story. We want it to become a world-class museum and at the same time stand as a major public statement of recognition and esteem for Chinese communities and their role in Australian history and society. We wanted to enable visitors to see into and understand the past and present real lives of Chinese Australians and their different communities, how they think, how they see themselves and others, how they see the political currents swirling around them and their future in this land. Although non-political, we want this museum to be a powerful corrective to the ugly racist narrative which has taken hold in Australia in recent years. Not stridently, but in the calm and civilised and evidence-based presentation of the rich diversity of both ordinary and extraordinary Chinese people. I wish Mavis Gok Yen could still be alive to see it, but her work is an inspiration for us, and I look forward to many others being inspired by her example and joining with us in elevating their stories into mainstream Australian history and society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for this wonderful and great opening remarks, about the book, about the significance of Mavis' book, and also about the significance of Mocha. Both are so important to Chinese Australian history, and not just, as you said, about how Chinese Australian look at it, but also, in terms of how Australian look at this history. So important. Now let's welcome Richard Horsberg to give a presentation about the book.
Well, thank you very much, Jing, and I just want to thank the Institute for your kind invitation to Shaman and I to talk about this wonderful book, South Flows the Pearl. And also I'd like to thank Stephen for his very, very generous words in the introduction. And more importantly, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. We really appreciate your attendance. This book has been released about 3 months ago now, and we've been completely overwhelmed by the positive response it's had from everyone who's read it. So I'm just going to talk for a short bit just to give you an introduction to the book for those of you who are new to the book. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now. That comes up, and where are we?
Yep, looks perfect. Fine.
Okay, there we go. Okay, I first met Shaman in Sydney in 1988, and it wasn't long after that I met her mother and the author of South Flows the Pearl, Mavis Gok Yen. Our meeting happened to coincide with the beginning of Mavis's journey in writing this book. One of the first questions you might ask is, well then, why is a book that was begun 35 years ago only now being published, and how could it possibly be significant or relevant today? So look, I hope what you hear today will answer that question, but in very simple terms, nothing like this book had been published in the field of Chinese Australian history in Australia when Mavis was writing it. And amazingly, nothing really like it has been published since. And for reasons that I'll explain later, this book could not be replicated today. So that also makes it very special. Mavis was not a historian, as Stephen indicated. She was 71 years old when she started the work of recording the interviews that she did starting this book, and that was in 1987. At the time, she was living on the old age pension. She was living in government subsidised housing. By the time she finished the manuscript, which was about in the year 2000, she was in her mid to late 80s. She'd written this book without any help from any professional historians or academics. So she'd done this completely by herself. And as been mentioned, she wasn't able to get it published before she died in 2008. So this is not an academic book. If a historian was doing oral histories, what they would usually do would they take extracts from the oral histories that they could use as case studies in their book, or they would use the extracts to validate the arguments they're proposing from their research. South Flows the Pearl, there is no analysis in the book. There is no argument, there is no theory proposed. You are just presented with 12 family histories written as first-person narratives. So other than the background material that Mavis wrote for each chapter, her role as author is really invisible. All the 12 families featured in the book had their ancestral origins in the villages of the Pearl River Delta, north of Macau and Hong Kong, as this is where nearly all the Chinese migration to Australia before the 1980s emanated from. Mavis was not the first person to record oral histories of Chinese Australians, but it's fair to say that when she started, no one had done interviews before, or perhaps since, on the scale that she did, or in the depth that Mavis did between 1987 and 1995, sorry, when she conducted her last interview. We'll talk a little bit more about Mavis later, but I believe the following points are important. She had the advantage of being from the same Chinese Australian community and the same generation as her interviewees. As mentioned, Mavis was born to a Chinese father and an Anglo-Australian mother in Perth in 2016. The 12 interviewees were all born around the same time period, give or take 10 or 15 years. She had the same life experiences as they did. So for each story they told her, she could respond with a similar experience from her own life. This generation had lived under the long years of the White Australia policy. So they were a generation that could be naturally cautious about what they may say or what they may reveal of themselves or their families to outsiders. Mavis was able to gain their confidence in a way that would never have occurred, for instance, if I, as a non-Chinese person from a different generation, interviewed them. So she was able to give them the assurance that what they told her will be treated with respect. Another important point about this generation, this particular generation, is the pivotal role they hold. All of them had parents and grandparents who came to Australia in the 1800s. So they could relate the first-hand stories handed down to them of those years. As I said, they themselves grew up under the White Australia policy years up through to the 1970s, and they could talk about those years and the difficulties they faced living in Australia. But they also would talk about their children and grandchildren who are alive today, growing up in a much more tolerant, we hope, multicultural Australia. So this is a pivotal generation that could look back to the past and look forward to today. What sets South Flows the Pearl apart from many other books is the scope and the depth of the material. In regards to the scope, there are 2 family stories from Western Australia, 2 from the Northern Territory, 2 from Queensland, 1 from a small rural town in New South Wales, 1 from Sydney's Chinatown. And many of the other stories touch on many regional towns all over the country. So Broome, Katherine, Alice Springs, Camberwell, Cairns, Atherton, Tamworth, Wellington, Bendigo, to name a few. To balance that, 2 of the interviewees were actually born in the Pearl River Delta and came to Australia as teenagers. So the scope of the stories is quite amazing, covering the whole width and breadth of Australia. Also, the depth of the material is outstanding. The interviewees could recall their lives in minute detail, which will delight the reader and possibly bring back many memories about their own families. Mavis's methodology was to record these interviews on cassette tapes, and you can see some of them in the picture on the top right. More than 45 hours of interviews she recorded. We've now had those digitised. She would then type them up in question and answer format, first on her manual typewriter, and then later when she obtained a computer, on her computer. So to construct these first-person narratives, she took all the answers provided to her by the interviewees, and sometimes over different days or months apart, and she joined them up to create a seamless story for each family. So when you read the book, it's just like sitting across the table from your grandmother or your grandfather, and they're just talking directly to you. She had a largely complete manuscript in the early 2000s, as I've said, but she couldn't find a publisher. And I think by the time she died, she'd probably given up hope that the book was ever going to be published. So that's where Shaman and I entered the scene. So she left us, as you can see here, with a box of old 3.5-inch floppy disks, which had all the computerized versions of each chapter. And so we had to transform those into Word files. So from all of this material, Shaman and I created a Word version of the manuscript that we then edited. Jing mentioned that finding the families was an important issue for us. By the time we started working on the book, all the interviewees except one had died, which is why I said this book could not be replicated today, because that generation is now past. So we had to find their descendants scattered all over Australia, firstly to let them know the book was coming out, but also to gather more information about their families. And sometimes in the stories, family members were named and events were mentioned, but we weren't quite sure how they were related. So they provided much more information as background for their family. And they also provided a wealth of photographs, many more than we actually used in the book. So I'd like to acknowledge the cooperation we've had from all those families. It's been marvellous. So I'm just going to finish. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book for you. I just want to introduce you to this photograph. This is possibly a very rare photograph, because this is Mavis on the right and her two younger sisters standing in the fields of the village of Chuksau Yuen in the Pearl River Delta in about 1928. This is the village, but for those of you who know the Wing On department stores in Shanghai and Hong Kong, they were all started by members of the Gok clan, and that's where Mavis's father was born as well. I haven't seen any other photos of an Australian family before World War II taken in a village, so this could possibly be very rare. And so in 1925, the family had moved to Shanghai, and in 1928, Mavis's father decided to take them to the village because his mother was quite elderly and he wanted to be there for her last couple of years. So they travelled from Shanghai by boat to Hong Kong, and they got on a junk, and they travelled from Hong Kong to the nearby river town of Sheke. And we're going to pick the story up in the morning when they left Sheke to take a 2-hour boat ride down to the village of Chuksau Yuen. So we're just going to read this excerpt from you. The junk to the village looked exactly like the Hong Kong ferry junk, but it was much smaller. It was just big enough to carry ferry passengers and produce. But instead of being towed, it was propelled by men working a treadmill that turned a paddle. All of them were Goks. It was a Gok enterprise that belonged to Chuksau Yuen. We were allowed to move around the junk freely, and I found the last journey fascinating. A strong and dazzling sun shone on the yellow waters of the Sheke River. All water in Chinese rivers then seemed to me to be yellow. On the left or eastern bank of the river, as we slowly moved southwards, green fields stretched as far as one could see. The tall green mountains in the background came closer as we moved south. On the right bank of the river was the Lungdu district with scattered villages. The mountains on that side were closer. Dad explained to me that Lungdu was where the bandits lived. The bandit situation had improved, but it still wasn't safe to take the riverside path and walk between Sheke and Chuksau Yuen. After 2 hours, we turned into a creek on the left. Very soon we passed the landing stage where a launch was tied up. The launch provided a service to Sheke and was operated by the Lee clan from Hung Mai village. The launch took only half an hour or less to reach Sheko. Both the launch and the junk services were safe. The launch was too fast for the bandits, and the junk employed a lot of men. 100 yards past the launch, we tied up at a stone landing stage. Beside it was a wooden bridge giving access to the rice fields beyond. This was Chakso Yuen village. Men and women were waiting with bamboo poles and baskets. We weren't required to carry anything. It was our first sight of the ancestral home, and I was very excited. So that just gives you a brief indication of the type of stories you'll read in the book. So I'll hand you back now to Jing.
Thank you so much, Richard. I mean, as you can see, this book is really amazing. I mean, it's not just full of so valuable historical recordings and photographs. It's quite emotional as well. So I'm sure, you know, when you met those families, the descendants, it just must be quite emotional. And when I'm reading this book, I really enjoyed it thoroughly. It's, as Richard said, it's a very easy reading in the sense it's like, you feel like you're reading stories about your family, about your relatives. So quite familiar stories. So we'd like to take this opportunity, today's opportunity to have a questions, you know, Q&A session with Richard and Xiaoman. So we will start this Q&A first. While we are having this conversation, you can post your questions, audience. You can post your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So at the end of the conversation, I will collect them and for the panel to respond. So feel free to put those questions when we start in this conversation. Okay, so I read this book, but I would like to ask questions, and Stephen and I like to ask questions more on behalf of the audience. So there are many things we feel like you would like to know as well. So my first question is, Richard and Xiaoman, can you enlighten the audience on the title of the book, South Flows the Pearl?
I'll take that question. It's a good question, but you wouldn't think that the title of the book would be a problem, but it actually took us quite a long time to settle on the name South Flows the Pearl. Choosing a name is a bit like choosing the name for your child. It can cause lots of arguments and disagreements. And as I've described before, it was very hard to encapsulate such a diverse book that covered the whole of Australia and so many different stories into a brief couple of catchy words for the title. We know what we didn't want. We didn't want cliched words like dragons or gold mountains or, you know, kangaroos or celestials or anything like that in the title. We had a working title, and that was Chinese Australian Voices, because it was an oral history book, and we knew that was going to be the subtitle of the book. But we also wanted to capture the sense of two countries and two cultures, because China is such a big part of this book, as is Australia. So it was quite an issue. It took us several months, and we had a little team of advisors, Sophie Lloyd-Wilson, who wrote the introduction, historian Michael Williams, and Cheryl Yin-Lo, who was the daughter of Evelyn Yin-Lo, whose picture is on the cover. So together we drew up lists of titles, and we even once on a Chinese Australian Facebook page advertised to give a free book to anyone who could come up with the best title. But in the end, I think it was Michael Williams suggested South Flows the Pearl, because all the interviewees had their ancestral origins there. The river flows southerly direction into the ocean between Macau and Hong Kong, and we liked the concept that the people then flowed south to all parts of Australia. And now we love the title. And I think the people we meet too have all said, no, that's a really nice title. So I'm going to actually hand you over to Xiaoman, and she's going to tell you the title in Chinese.
Well, there is actually no official Chinese name for the book. But in an exhibition at the Museum of Chinese in Australia recently, I used 明珠南流 as the translation.
It's great. I know there is a story about the title. So, you know, it's so good to hear this story from both of you. And it's quite interesting, you know, it's as Richard, as you explained, you don't want to be too like a dragon gold and all this stereotype of Chinese. But then this also tells a lot about the early Chinese migrants. So it's a great title. Yeah. Stephen, would you like to ask them questions? You are on mute.
Mavis left a treasure trove of tapes, manuscripts, floppy disks, all of this kind of stuff. Were you aware that she was doing this, that she'd been conducting these interviews, or did this come as a bit of a surprise?
We knew my mother was conducting interviews and writing the books, but we had no direct involvement in it. My mother was living in Canberra, and when she started the interviews, and we were in Sydney, and she moved to Sydney not long after our son was born. We were working full time with a young child, so we were busy. We really didn't know how big a project she was undertaking. She had several motivations. She always loved writing from the time she was a child. In 1929, when she was 13, she wrote from Singh to a newspaper in Perth, in WA, asking for a pen pal to write to her. In the letter, she described her voyage by ship from Perth to Hong Kong and Shanghai. Because she lived in China for so long, she also wrote a lot of letters during her life to friends and families in Sydney. But to be a writer was an ambition that she wasn't really able to follow in China until she came back to Australia in 1981. She started a Bachelor of Arts in Professional Writing in Canberra when she was 65. So she knew what she wanted to do. There was movement in Australia in the 1980s to start doing oral history. So she got involved in that. She and her brother Harry and two sisters also had a great interest in their family story. In the Cultural Revolution, when she was made to write out the story of her life, that in turn led her to think about all the other people of her generation. So she combined all those different aspects, the writing, the oral history, and the family history, into this project. A family friend also gave her encouragement to publish the stories.
So we might say that out of the Cultural Revolution, there were not many things good that came from it, but this is a really good thing that came from the Cultural Revolution or originated there.
Yes.
That she records the lives of 12 Chinese Australian families, and Richard, as you said earlier, the geographical spread is right across the country. So the raw material, as it were, was abundant. Do you know how she chose her interviewees, and was it because of connections amongst them, or did you discover those connections from reading through her research?
I'll answer the question first. Some people were known to my mother, like all family connections. For example, Leslie Chang has the first story in the book, was a family friend. He and his brother, who's actually the father of Dr. Victor Chan, went to school with my uncle Harry when they were in Shanghai in the 1920s. after returning to Australia, my mother's sister, Edna, kept in contact with him. Another example is when my mother's family lived in Sheke in about 1929, she also met Franklin G, one of the other interviewees, because he was sent to China as a child like them. John Fong's family was introduced to her by a good family friend from Perth. He talked about the Chinese in Western Australia. My mother also joined Australia-China Friendship Society, both in Canberra and in Sydney. People she met there introduced more people to interview. So it wasn't planned beforehand who she was going to interview.
I think the fact that the interviewees came from all around Australia just may have been a happy accident, because all the interviews were actually done in Sydney or Canberra, but it just turned out that those people had their family origins all across the country. So it wasn't planned, but it does give this book a huge footprint right across the country. And in the end, this is one of the unique features of the book. So a lot of history books naturally would tend to concentrate on one particular location or one family. But South Flows the Pearl has this massively large canvas stretching right across the country.
It is very indeed. It's so interesting, the choices of these interviewees, yeah, and then the stories, and just across the country. It's such a interesting answers to hear from you as well. I have a technical question, because in this book there are 22 stories or chapters, and of 12 families, as we mentioned. Some stories were told by the same interviewees, but they are not placed together. So, they jumped chapters. So I'm wondering, how are the stories sequenced in the book? What is the arrangement order you based on?
Well, I think there's a very loose, I would say, narrative arc to the book that Mavis adhered to. The early stories in the book tend to look back to the early migration of Chinese to Australia, going back to the gold rush days of the 1850s up to roughly around Federation of Australia in 1901, when the White Australia policy began. So those early chapters were sort of answering the questions, well, why did Chinese come here? But also what was happening in China that perhaps influenced them to come as well. And they also talk a lot about the clan associations that were set up in the 1800s to support the Chinese community here. A lot of these associations were a great assistance to them for people in a foreign country who didn't have much English, and sometimes a very hostile society. So these associations worked as sort of de facto banks or post offices and provided temporary accommodation and many other services for the migrants. The middle group of stories, I guess, tend to concentrate more on the years between World War I and World War II. While these people talk about their parents and grandparents, they also talk about themselves growing up under the White Australia policy, and so the issues like discrimination and the shrinking, as the population of Chinese declined between the wars, the shrinking job opportunities. And these stories also include the ones of children like Mavis herself being taken back to China. So this is a very interesting aspect of the book, of the experiences of these young Australian-born children suddenly thrust into a very overwhelming culture in China. The later stories tend to focus more on post-World War II experiences as White Australia policy broke down, and the interviewees were sort of moving out of a more close-knit society into more mainstream society. And they also talk about, say, their grandchildren and children and how successful they have been. And also some of the later stories include stories of people who travel to China for the first time when they've retired. So they've lived with China all their life in the background, but now they actually experience it when they're in their 70s or 80s.
Yeah, now it make perfect sense now. So hearing what you just said about how it's arranged, it is more like on the content, based on the content, and also, you know, chronological order as well. So that makes perfect sense now. Yeah. I have another question, because apparently Mavis spoke English, Cantonese, and Mandarin. That was her advantage of interviewing all these people in their languages, depending what language they speak. So my question is, were the interviews conducted in one of the 3 languages? And when it wasn't English, who translated into English?
Okay, the interviews actually conducted only in 2 languages, English and Cantonese, not Mandarin. My mother's first language was English. Later, when she was taken to China as a child, she learned to speak Cantonese from her stepmother after her mother passed away. The high school she went in Shanghai was set up by the British, with teachers went there from UK and other parts of Europe. She learned to speak Mandarin as she lived in China for so long, but her spoken Mandarin was not as good as the Cantonese. In China, she mainly worked with people who knew English. 10 of the interviews were conducted in English. 2 or 3 of these Australian-born people could speak fluent Cantonese, but most of the others had limited or no knowledge of Cantonese at all. For example, Hoi Li had Cantonese-speaking parents, and his mother could not speak English, but he mostly spoke English as a child. But it was only when he got a job in Sydney Chinatown with a Chinese firm that his Cantonese improved. 2 of the interviews with Li Singh and Liang Pui were conducted in Cantonese, but my mother recorded those into English. There's no translation, just recorded straight into English. Li Singh actually spoke mainly in Longdu dialect, which is very, it's got the Fujian dialect influence, because that's where the people migrated from, but understood that some English. So with the help of Liang Pui and another interviewee and a mixture of Cantonese and English, she was able to understand what was said. So all the interviewees use Chinese words and phrases that they learned from their parents.
That's really fascinating. You know,
Yeah.
like this additional information is really fascinating, and it's a very insightful. That's not in the book. So
Yeah.
pleased that we're having this conversation, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, another really fascinating part of your own research is that, as you note in the acknowledgements, that none of the family members of the interviewees who you tracked down, none of them was aware of the occurrence or existence of these interviews. How did they react? I mean, were they delighted, pleased? Were they shocked? Did they not want their family stories told? You know, how did that go?
Well, I'll take that question. That was one of my jobs in the process, and it was interesting. So it was with some trepidation that we approached some of the families, because, as you said, we weren't quite sure how they were going to react. But as we've got to know them, actually, some of them now say that Xiaoman and I know more about the families than they do. So but it varied. You have to remember these interviews were done 30 to 35 years ago now. So some of them might have had a vague memory that their parents were interviewed, but nothing resulted from it. So they probably forgot until we knocked on their door. Mavis actually sent the interviewees draft chapters. So when we introduced ourselves, some of them dug out some of these old interviews, but they had no idea where they'd come from or what their purpose was. With the general renewed interest in China, in family history, like with the Ancestry.com and all these things in the last 20 years, a lot of the families had actually done extensive research into their own families over the last 10 or 20 years. So that was invaluable for us when we met them. So I was able to use that information, and we wanted to have a little background. It was not in the book, but I created a family tree for each family. I created more background information. So in the stories, lots of names and events are mentioned, but without some explanation. So I had to find out what all these things meant. A lot of them had family documents and artifacts they were able to show us, which was really interesting. And of course, the photographs is what we want. We really wanted as well, because Mavis hadn't had many photographs. So they were terrific, and we didn't get any knockbacks from any families. It took a lot of work to find them because they're all over the country, but we managed to do it in most, except for one or two cases, we managed to do that. And I actually put together a little email group, and I sent them out probably 14 or 15 emails over the course of the last 2 years, because the publishing process has coincided with COVID and lockdowns. So it took a bit longer than we thought. So I tried to keep them all involved, which is very important. But some of them now become very good friends, so that's wonderful.
That's great. I mean, this is quite a massive undertaking on the part of you both. So in addition to, I mean, tracking them down and putting together family trees and so on, what other kind of research did you have to do?
I'll answer this question first. And I mainly took on 3 tasks. One was to digitize all the cassette tapes recording into digital. It's about over 45 hours. We then be able to listen to the original interviews, which helped us to clear any queries. For example, the interviewees use Chinese words or phrases every now and then, so we could check exactly what was said. Sometimes my mother misheard what was said, and we were able to correct a few things. The second one was to provide all the Chinese characters for all Chinese words and phrases, including the names of people and organizations, villages, and places in China. Many people helped me, and my family members here and overseas, and Cantonese-speaking friends in Sydney. The last one was to create all these Chinese maps that identify the locations of all the villages mentioned in the book. With the help of the internet, I was able to use Google Maps and the Chinese equivalents, such as Bianmin, Hengxun, Gaode, and Baidu, to trace the outlines and in locating the villages.
I guess the main work that I was doing was Mavis wrote the short introductions for each chapter and a short introduction to the book herself, but it was mainly, it was an analysis, it was a historical background, and she only had limited information to rely on. So I read up on more of those topics, and where I could, if I could add a bit more value, I did add a little bit more or change things around a little bit. I did all the footnotes for the book. We didn't want this to be an academic style book, but we felt there were significant historical events and people's names that needed explanation for the contemporary reader, because this goes back in time and some people may not know who's been spoken about. And there are also some Australian idiomatic words used, because 2 or 3 of the interviewees spoke in broad Australian accents, and it's like going back in time, listening to someone, an Australian, talking in the 1920s or the 1930s. So they used, you know, words like drovers and cockies and all sorts of things. So I thought for overseas readers, I thought I'd do a footnote on some of those things as well.
Oh, it's fascinating. I think, you know, it's a task. Obviously, it's quite a big task, but also very, very interesting. I mean, you know, it's a lot of detective skills involved. Discoveries, and I'm sure give you a lot of thrills, you know, each time you discover something. Yeah, it'd be really interesting. Most of you have a long career, you know, you doing public service and doing the data analysis. I'm just wondering whether this job, this task is the most interesting actually in your entire career. So it's really fascinating. You're discovering all this. You know, in the introduction, Dr. Sophia Lloyd Wilson said, this is a unique book because it was researched and written by Mavis as an insider, because she is the person who lived the life and spoke the language. And so it was the first book by the Chinese Australian historian. The book also contains Mavis' own family history told by her brother. And their grandfather came to Bendigo in about 1860. 10 years later, went back to China after having made enough money. So it's quite typical early Chinese migrant story. And then their father Ming arrived in Cairns in 1897. The customer officer asked his name. So he said, Guo Ming Kok Ming. And then customer service officer said, all right, I'll give you an English name. You are now called William Kok Ming. So from then on, because when I was reading this, I found really interesting and explanatory, because the family name Guo Kok then became the middle name, and Ming, which is the first family name, which became a family name. So Mavis' maiden name was Mavis Kok Ming. And her brother's name was Harry Kok Ming, you know, so their family name became Ming. So that partly explained how early Chinese migrants got to their rather unusual names. That's very explanatory, it's fascinating. Xiaoman, can you tell us how your Chinese grandfather married your Australian grandmother? And how was their interracial marriage regarded back then?
Yeah, the story of the marriage tells you a lot about the Australian society at the time. My grandparents met in Perth in WA. My grandfather, Kok Ming, went to WA to take over the ownership of a Chinese fruit and veggie shop from his brother. And my grandmother, Mabel Jenkins, went to WA with her mother and her unmarried sisters. She worked as a dressmaker. She was a very committed Christian woman, and her church provided English lessons for migrants. So she volunteered to teach English. My grandfather was one of the migrants learning English there. So that's where they met. There was a lot of opposition to the interracial marriages back then. There were groups in WA that wanted laws preventing European women marrying non-Europeans. This was also a view of some Christian churches. And the minister at my grandmother's church refused to marry them. They ended up going to Melbourne in 1910 and married there. When they returned to live in Perth, many of the European women in the street where they lived would have nothing to do with my grandmother. Her sister stood by her, but so that part was good. She was friendly with another European lady who also married to a Chinese man. But when the husband had a quarrel with my grandfather over some business matters, the two were not allowed to be friends anymore. Marrying a Chinese, and she lost her citizenship and became an alien by marriage. The marriage was very successful. When the family moved to Shanghai in 1925, my grandmother caught smallpox after just a couple of months and died when she was only about 46. My grandfather was heartbroken.
Wow, what amazing story. It's a soul, yes. Isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we've mentioned several times that one of the unique things about this book is that the stories are told about some of the very earliest Chinese migrants. And one of the fascinating ones among these, I think the oldest interviewee was Singh, born in 1894 and was 95 years old when he was interviewed by Mavis. I think it would be great if you could share with the audience today some insights into his story.
Yes, Singh, it's not often in 2022 you get to read an interview with a man born in 1894, so that's a good part of the book. Singh, he was probably what you call the archetypical Chinese emigrant of the late 1800s and early 1900s. He was the only interviewee who you would call what you would call a sojourner, in that he came to Australia to work over many decades, but maintained a wife and family in China. So he kept on travelling backwards and forwards between the two countries many times. So he came to Australia when he was in 1909, when he was just in his early teens, and ended up working in his uncle's furniture factory in the Sydney suburb of Waterloo. Took him 7 years to save up enough money to go back in 1916 to get married. But as a humble carpenter, of course, he couldn't bring his wife here under the White Australia policy. So what he would do, he would go back to China periodically, usually long enough for his wife to fall pregnant. So that went on. So that he did that 2 or 3 times. But his wife died in 1930 after having 3 children. So he married a second time in China and had 3 more children before the start of World War II. So by the time World War II started, and you couldn't travel back anymore because of the war, he'd been back to China probably 7, 8, 9 times and had fathered 6 children. He wasn't able to bring his second wife out to Australia until the late 1950s, when entry restrictions started to ease. So if you think about it, he got married in 1916. He couldn't bring his wife out until about 1956. So he'd spent 40 years of being distanced from his wife and his children, who he probably didn't even know that well. And you've got to think of how hard that was mentally to live in those types of circumstances. And the interesting thing, when his wife did come out and he got all his family, children out here, he never went back to China again. So that would indicate, he was happy, had his family with him, and he didn't want to go back again. And if we've got time, we probably haven't got time, but I'll just leave that one there. So
I know so many interesting, things listening from your answers. Yes, we have run out of time. We would like to take questions from audiences as well. So maybe we just get Stephen to ask the last question and then we go on to the audience.
Okay, Mavis's life is a great story. Are you going to write a biography of Mavis?
Well, yes, I'm going to do it. And I actually started this before South Flows the Pearl sort of took over. And so I need to get back to that project. And she lived an amazing life. And
yes,
very briefly, I'll just say that for a humble typist and teacher, she lived an extraordinary life, especially in China, from the World War II onwards. And as I say, she was a great letter writer, and we actually have over 200 letters that she wrote from China to Australia from 1940 through to 1980s. To give you an example, she wrote a letter, she was in Shanghai in 1949 when the Red Army came in. She went out on the street and she wrote her descriptions of seeing the army there in the streets and what it was like on that day. And so there are many wonderful things like that. And she had many friends, foreign friends and Chinese friends, that once again I won't have time to go into, but if you read the book, when I finally get around to writing it, it'll be an absolutely fascinating book, and probably unlike any other Australian, other than, say, a diplomat like yourself, Stephen, or a journalist who's been to China. But for an average Australian, I don't think anyone had an experience like she had in both countries.
Mm.
Yeah, we can't wait to read that story. I just had brief, notes about the Mavis's life. Just fascinating.
Mm.
So yeah, looking forward to that book. So we go on to the audience. To be fair to audience, we ask them to ask questions. So I can see 3 questions. First of all, is who is the remaining interviewee that is still living? From Colin.
You want to answer that one, Siobhan?
Yes, Peter Wong.
Peter Wong, for Sydney siders, was very much involved in the Chinese Youth League, and so he was the youngest interviewee, born in 1938. So he's now in his mid-80s, and he came out to Australia he was one of who came out to Australia as a teenager. Where his grandfather had a market garden at Manly Vale, and which is now on the site is now a high school. But he is very much involved in the Chinese Youth League, and he's a wonderful man to speak to, very knowledgeable man. We've had many great conversations with him, and still takes a great interest in world politics and affairs and things. So yeah, a lovely man.
I just feel like you two should write a book about how you come up, how you compile this book. So many interesting stories. Roland has a question. Thank you so much, from the Australian National Maritime Museum. That's where Roland is from. It is always delightful to hear to learn that these invaluable oral histories have been saved and are available to the public. I wanted to ask where the digitalized files of the interviews are going to be stored. Are they going to be part of a certain collection and available to researchers?
We've given a lot of thought to that, and we would like to donate them somewhere. We've had discussions with the State Library, and but many of them, because they're old cheap cassette tapes, and many of them are in poor condition. So that's why we digitise them. But they need to go somewhere where historians can access them. So we will definitely do that. We just haven't just made a final decision on that. Shaman, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, we will be donating them, the cassette and the digitized format, and we will be donating them, but at the moment we haven't done anything on that, and probably more than likely State Library. We don't know who's the most appropriate organisation to take this.
Yeah, it'd be really, really interesting to know where it will end up. I think Roland has very good questions.
Just a bit further to that, Mavis also had a lot of writings and other things that she left behind, and I'd like to leave those as well. For instance, we've got a 40-page description of her time during the Cultural Revolution. And I'll say we've got these letters, so we've got over 200 letters, and we'd eventually perhaps set up an archive, a Mavisian archive, in an institution somewhere, so all these can be accessed in future.
I just want to quickly add something. The bits Richard referring to on the day, the liberation of Shanghai, and she went out records how the army behaved, was just like the play we used to see. For all the Chinese audience would know, 南京路上好八连. It was just matching those descriptions.
Oh, that's a bit fascinating story about the Mavis, and I'm sure many people looking forward to waiting to read those stories. Last question from Jing Hui. Thanks for the explanation about the book title. I had a thought that it's linked with the River Pearl in Canton. My question is about the theme of the 4 department stores in Shanghai and Hong Kong. Is there any other information that you want to share with us about this topic?
The 4 department stores.
Yeah.
We have not done anything on that, and my mother's family is related to them, but my mother's branch is not come from the Wing brothers branch. It's different. They're all descended from the same gods, but they're on the white side, whereas the Wing brothers is on the blue branch of the family.
It's interesting that when the family went back to China in Shanghai in 1925, Gok Ming instantly got a job in the Wing department store as a departmental manager. So those family connections were very strong. And Mavis's brother Harry, whose story is in the book, he gives a really good insight into, he got a job there in a clerical type job within the department store in Shanghai. So you get to see how the shop operates in the back room. And he was a fairly tempestuous sort of guy. So you have arguments that he has with other people there, all sorts of things. So you get a little insight into how those shops were run from the book.
Could I just add, yes, we have a world expert on this topic here in Sydney, in the person of Dr. Sophie Laurie-Wilson at Sydney Uni, who has written extensively about not just about the department stores, but about the context of Chinese Australians who were living here and who went back mainly to Shanghai, but other parts in South China, for example. So I suggest that you follow up with Sophie's work. It's great.
So Sophie actually wrote a little bit about Mavis in her book about Australians in Shanghai. And of course, Mavis translated the book Shanghai Princess, which is about Daisy Kwok. And Sophie has written a lot about Daisy. So yes, we're in touch with Sophie quite a lot.
Yeah, great.
Well, Sophie is actually in the audience and she sent a message to us and she said, an excellent presentation. I learn more every time I hear Richard and Xiaoman speak. Stephen and Jane, you have done a wonderful job moderating and chairing. I'm moved every time I watch a presentation about this book and about Mavis. Just brilliant, wonderful presentation. I can't agree with Sophie more on this. It is really wonderful, and we can keep talking about this, but we have passed the time, obviously. But thank you so much, Richard, Xiaoman, and Stephen, for this wonderful, conversation. And there's a lot of things that are actually not in the book, not just about the book, but also, behind the book as well. So highly recommend to everyone who's interested in buying this book. It's really valuable and very interesting to read. So lastly, I would also like to thank the audience who stayed here, and we have so many of you, and for attending this first session of our Chinese Australian History Series 3. We will upload the recording of the conversation on our website in a week or two, and you can, as I said, purchase this book, please. I just want to give you a bit of information for our next session. For the next session in June, we have invited Dr. Elena Camp, a lecturer and researcher at the School of Social Sciences at Western Sydney University. And she's going to talk about her newly published book called Intersectional Lives, Chinese Australian Women in White Australia. So just the title, you can tell it's a fascinating book, again, in Chinese Australian history. We will email you all the date, time and register of the next session, so stay tuned. And thanks again, Richard, Xiaoman, and Stephen, and thank you all, audience. You have a good evening. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Bye.
Thank you.